After 6 months marked mostly by stalemate, Libya's civil war suddenly has come to a head. Now, despite the sound of sporadic gunfire this Monday, the celebrations continuing in Tripoli, this as the search continues for the man who's ruled that country for nearly 42 years. With 2, possibly 3 of Muammar Gaddafi's sons now in custody and state television now in rebel hands, you probably won't be seeing any more images of news presenters defiantly brandishing handguns. However, Libya's troubles are far from over. First off, there's the fate of Muammar Gaddafi that's still up in the air. Will his passing end the fighting in a desert land where tribal bonds and rivalries matter so much? And will the West walk away quietly from it all? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about Gaddafi's downfall. And with us to talk about it are France 24's Chris Moore. How are you, sir?
Hello, Francois. Very well.
Also with us, Captain Philip Stoner, former Deputy UK Defence Attaché in Paris. Richard Dalton, the former British ambassador to Libya, joins us from Richmond in the UK, and also in London, Lindsay German of the Stop the War Coalition. We want to welcome all of you to the France 24 debate. I want to also thank our viewers. We've gotten lots of feedback on the France 24 debate Facebook page. And by the way, you can also join the conversation on Twitter, where our handle is @FrancoisF24. So, 6 months after the first demonstrations, 5 months after the NATO bombing campaign began, the big break coming on Sunday as those troops from the rebel side entered the capital. The events, Christopher Moore, have suddenly gone fast. We've had in the past lots of boasts and claims. What's going on?
I think the striking thing is just how fast it's gone. It's only a few weeks ago since we were talking about stalemate, since we were seeing Abdel Fattah Yunus, the former Gaddafi figure who became a rebel commander, being assassinated, since we were seeing Mustafa Abdel Jalil sacking his cabinet. That was a real low, if you like, for the Western powers that have backed this entire campaign. A lot of serious questions being asked about how successful it would be. Since then, we've seen this sudden, really, military advance by the rebel movement, not in the east, but in the west of Libya. A lot of the early fighting was in the east. In the end, it happened in the west. We don't know exactly how it happened, what kind of help and advice the rebel fighters were perhaps getting from some of those Western backers. And the other thing that happened within the last week or so were these mysterious talks in Tunisia, which we never really got to the bottom of. Both sides, the rebels and the Gaddafi sides, denying that any direct negotiations took there. Moved forward a couple of days, and suddenly we see the rebel fighters advancing eastwards along that coast road, really pretty much unopposed. I think the most striking thing there was how quickly they managed to take the HQ of the Khamis brigades, one of the most feared brigades in Libya, and pretty much walk into Tripoli unopposed.
All right, let's pick up on that. Richard Dalton, is there a causality between those talks that Chris Moore was mentioning and the sudden ease with which the rebels advanced?
I don't think so, no. I think there's been a sudden collapse of morale as a result of the arrival on the doorsteps of Tripoli from 3 directions of opposition forces, together with a contribution, obviously a major contribution, from people who live in Tripoli rising against the government at the same time. This was a well-coordinated strategy which appears to be working so far.
Philip Stoner, are you surprised?
Yeah, I am surprised. Certainly, if you asked me 2 weeks ago, there's been a sort of an acceleration, which I think very few people were expecting, and certainly we wouldn't prejudge. The last couple of days, there was a sort of such a moment, a momentum building up, which I think, when you looked at the distances involved, Zawiya from Tripoli, so close by comparison to where the rebels were when they started, right on the other side of Libya, and they've been able to sort of somehow not only keep going, not only keep their supply lines going, but also keep the places that they've actually taken and hold those places. How they've managed to do that will come out in the history books, and with perhaps some of the assistance that they've got from other countries, NATO obviously as well.
I was going to say, there's an obvious answer to that, isn't there? How much is NATO weighing on all of this?
I think NATO has probably weighed quite a lot on this. Not least of all because it's managed to actually be involved but not be that involved, and learn perhaps from some of the mistakes of Afghanistan and Iraq in the past, where they've gone in far too hard, far too fast, and far too present on the screens and on the media. They've quite clearly, if they have been there on the ground, they've been basically wearing jeans and T-shirts and doing things in the background and helping, so that what we see on the media, which is extremely powerful from the point of view of the vast majority of everybody, is actually the rebels who are doing it, the freedom fighters, as they've been called now.
Let me ask you, Lindsay German in London. So far, the bloodbath that many had predicted for Tripoli has not played out. Are you relieved?
Well, of course, I think nobody wants a bloodbath anywhere, although we should remember that the heaviest bombardment by NATO has been in the last 2 days on Tripoli. So the idea that this all happened in the past and this is just the rebels carrying out their victory now is not actually the case. NATO is very, very directly intervening right up to the last minute, and I think that the Libyans will become aware that NATO will not easily give up. They made a statement yesterday saying that they're willing to work with a new government in Libya, which it gives you some idea of them seeing what a central role that they have here.
Richard Dalton, when you hear what Lindsay just said there, and Philip Stoner mentioning how you do have these special forces in the background, perhaps helping holding the hand, if you will, for the rebels who did not know how to fight. And Chris Moore can attest to that when he was there back in April. What can the Transitional National Council do without NATO?
Well, it can do almost everything except bomb targets from the air. This campaign has gone well in the last few weeks because of the efforts of the infantry on the ground, with key targets being taken out from the air. But no war was ever won from the air. And before this idea that there was a major role by special forces takes hold, I think I should make clear this is nothing but rumor. There were some stories 6 weeks ago about Westerners who could have been special forces, but nobody has owned up to it. And if there was a role for outsiders, it has been very limited.
Christopher Moore, your thoughts?
Well, I think I'm not in a position to speculate on the special forces angle, having not been in Libya myself since, as you said, April. It is very clear that the NATO, in the past sort of few weeks or so, NATO has really upped.
But tell me about the fighters that you saw when you were in Benghazi back in April.
Back in April in Benghazi, they were enthusiastic, though not necessarily the best equipped or trained fighters. So I mean, they would tell you regularly that they were going to make their way all the way to Tripoli and do various horrible things to Colonel Gaddafi. In the end, once NATO had intervened, the front line was pretty much being held by NATO somewhere between Ajdabia and Brega, not so far down the road from Benghazi. Now, NATO could stop the Gaddafi troops advancing any further towards Ajdabia. They could encourage even, or give encouragement to, the rebels to go forward up to Brega. You'd hear on a virtually daily basis that the rebels were about to take Brega, but we were still hearing that 2 or 3 days ago. It never really happened. Their operation wouldn't have worked in any way without NATO, of course.
Captain Stoner, if you're motivated but completely unqualified, how long does it take to make you into a soldier?
Well, I mean, if you're really motivated, it's amazing what you can do in a very short space of time. But I think, Richard Dalton's point is absolutely right from the point of view that it is only rumour about the issue of special forces, but that's exactly how the special forces, if indeed they were involved, would like to have it. But you're looking at the facts on the ground, it would have been absolutely impossible for the rebels to achieve what they have achieved, not only by having the heavy air power support from NATO, having the intelligence coming from drones, no doubt supplied by the Americans, without connecting that some way to them on the ground. And that would have been done by certain people who've been infiltrated on the ground in plain clothes.
That's tell you what's improved in the last couple of weeks, really, is that level of coordination. It's been something which was talked about since right from the start of this armed conflict, but it never really became reality until very, very recently.
Now, of course, at the center of it all, there's still one man who's yet to be accounted for. We're talking about the Libyan leader of nearly 42 years, Muammar Gaddafi, who's always said he's going to be staying put, like he said it on the radio less than 24 hours ago. He's been saying it ever since this conflict began. Let's listen to what he said back in March.
Why would I leave? Who would take my place? I don't have the authority to do that. I am not a president or a head of government. I am from the people.
Richard Dalton, what are Muammar Gaddafi's options and what do you suspect he'll do?
We don't know what's in his mind. He sees himself as having a historic mission, and I suspect he won't accept until the very, very last minute that all is up and that it has failed. So he might die in the fighting, he might be captured, he might be in a location outside Tripoli and be not telling the truth when he says he is in Tripoli. He might therefore want to try and maintain resistance from that situation to try and mount a last stand somewhere, perhaps in the south of Libya. But I think that the most likely option is that he will be caught up with one way or another, and that he will be captured. Now, at that point, the national authorities of Libya, once they've constituted themselves, will have to decide if they want him tried in Libya or submitted to the International Criminal Court. And we don't know what they will decide.
The issue about what will happen to Muammar Gaddafi is one issue, but let me just ask you, Richard Dalton, from your experience as being the British ambassador in Libya, Gaddafi has been painted as a man of the 60s who fancies himself kind of like Che Guevara. Do you see him actually handing himself in?
He'll be extremely reluctant to do so. He will find it very hard to believe the truth of the collapse of his support, if that's indeed what happens in the next few days in Tripoli. And I don't see him voluntarily taking the exile route.
Philip Stoner, on this show in the past, we've openly speculated when we've seen NATO bombings on his compound about whether or not there was an untold mission to, well, for NATO to take him out. At this point in time, what is NATO's mission when it comes to Muammar Gaddafi?
I think, as far as NATO is concerned at the moment, and listening to what Anders Fogh Rasmussen said this morning, NATO really is in a position where it has to take a step back and realize that so far as NATO is concerned, one might have different views elsewhere, but as far as NATO is concerned, so far so good. But what they mustn't do now is get wrapped up in a situation where they are trying to sort of help out the rebels, the freedom fighters, too much, and start to take over this particular war. It's quite remarkable that they've got this stage, but now they need to actually take a step back.
Lindsay German, what's the best case scenario now when it comes to what happens to Muammar Gaddafi?
Well, it's clear that Gaddafi is finished as a ruler of Libya. I'm against him being tried in the International Criminal Court. I think that the whole setup with the court is one of hypocrisy, where the people like George Bush and Tony Blair are never indicted, but it's always supposed war criminals who are treated like this, who are enemies of the West. So I think it's up to the Libyan people to decide what they do with Gaddafi, as I think it's up to the Libyan people to decide what they do with their country. And the absolute minimum is that the NATO intervention has to stop, that all special forces have to be removed, that this should be Libya for the Libyans. This is what David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy claim that they want. This is what now has to happen, because what I fear with this is that we have now the rehabilitation of so-called humanitarian intervention. This has been discredited very widely in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. One of the aims, I think, of what's happened in Libya was to re-establish humanitarian intervention as something that the West was allowed to do, and it will be very dangerous if this spreads to Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East.
So what you're saying, in effect, is that on the tail end of this, there shouldn't be threats to intervene in places like Syria?
There shouldn't be threats to intervene anywhere else. These Middle East uprisings, the Arab Spring, were the act of the Arab people themselves. They did tremendously to overthrow the Tunisian and Egyptian presidents in the teeth of opposition, among others, from the British and the EU, at least to start with. You wouldn't think so now, but that was actually the situation. They used the growing civil war in Libya to intervene. They want to intervene in Syria, but they are very nervous about intervening in Syria. Success for them in Libya should not be used as the idea that they can go and intervene elsewhere, because we have in the Middle East a very dangerous situation. We have a whole series of countries that have dictators or despots who run them. If you look at what happened, what coincided with the intervention in Libya, the beginning of the bombing, was also the Saudi crackdown on Bahrain. These are all things that are connected. It was the attempt to stop the Arab Spring going in the direction which they thought would be dangerous for Western interests. And the worst thing for the people of the Middle East is more Western intervention now.
Richard Dalton, your thoughts briefly before we go to the break on the issue of what lessons will be drawn from the way NATO handled itself?
The right or duty to intervene where a government isn't respecting the rights of its citizens to a massive degree is circumscribed in international law, and the right to mandate that activity lies in the United Nations, in the Security Council in particular. And of course, nobody is going to ask the Security Council for such a mandate in future unless there is regional support for the intervention. I think that's what the Libya precedent shows, is that in the right circumstances, where the problem is not so great, or there is no one state which is acting as patron or protector of the offending state, that the international community can get involved and stay within the terms of the mandate given it through the UN.
Through the UN. We're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. The France 24 debate continues.